We can speak now to the man until a month ago had Osborne's job, the former UK Chancellor Alistair Darling. He joins us now live from Westminster. Mr. Darling, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. George Osborne says that he believes that if the system that he outlined last night had been in place, then the financial crisis would have been greatly diminished. How much was the FSA to blame?
Well, look, first of all, there are an awful lot of lessons that need to be learnt from what went wrong. But the architecture of the regulatory system, whilst important, was not the reason that so much difficulty was caused. Indeed, if you look around the world, most developed countries had precisely the same problems. There was no one model of regulation. And indeed, ours was an awful lot more simple than most other countries. The real reason the problems arose is because regulators in different countries across the world failed to understand that it wasn't good enough simply to give one institution a clean bill of health. You had to look at the relationships and the connections between banks, between financial institutions. That's what failed, and that's what made the situation so difficult 2 or 3 years ago.
And Mervyn King says that if there was, I guess if he had been in charge, if the FSA hadn't been there, then somebody would have been looking at the systemic causes. Do you take that point, that if he'd been there looking at the systemic causes rather than the FSA, having that role to look at individual banks, that this system, that the crisis could have certainly been lessened, if not averted? Well,
no, I don't think he's quite saying that. And, you know, I don't think that analysis holds anyway. If you look at what happened, this is that when this crisis hit the United Kingdom, it started as a result of one of our smaller banks having huge problems raising money following the collapse of the subprime mortgage market in the United States. Now, the problem was, firstly, regulators were not talking to each other, you know, as much as they should have been. And secondly, as I said, people didn't look at the connections between banks. But, you know, it's always been the case. The Bank of England has been responsible for financial stability for the last 13 years. The FSA dealt with the day-to-day financial supervision and regulation. Yes, of course they could have worked more closely together, and of course mistakes were made. But I think if you look at the lessons you need to learn, it is, yes, the architecture matters, but what is the most important thing is the quality, skills and the judgment of individual regulators. That's what failed, and that is what contributed to the crisis. Of course, let's not forget that the main responsibility must lie with the boards of the banks and the other institutions who got things so badly wrong.
OK, so looking forward then, do you think that this new system outlined last night would stop some of those mistakes happening again? I mean, it is all up to individuals. Do you think that now the system will allow them to talk more to one another?
Well, there's no reason on earth why they couldn't be talking to each other. And actually, you've got exactly the same people involved. Now, what the government is proposing is that a bit of the Financial Services Authority is going to be shunted into the Bank of England. The exact chain of accountability is not yet clear. That's still evolving. Now, you know, if changes are to be made, and, you know, the new government, because of its coalition, has a majority, you know, that's up to them. My fear is that they don't actually concentrate on what matters, and that is the skills and judgment, the right questions being asked by the regulators. You've got to get that right. You also have to have very clear lines of accountability, so you can say, in the event of anything going wrong, whose fault is it, or, you know, who should be held to account. The other thing is, of course, whatever you do, you've still got two people at the table. You've still got the Finance Minister, the Chancellor. You've still got the governor, and of course, you know, any difficulties they've got or differences they've got to resolve. So, you know, whatever system you have,
it didn't sound last night that they had very many differences. They certainly seem to be singing from the same hymn sheet.
No, I'm not suggesting they had any differences on these reforms, but I'm suggesting that if you have a particular crisis, there will come a time when, you know, the central bank may say, look, the government needs to put more money into it. The Chancellor has to agree to that or not. Equally, the Chancellor might say to the independent central bank, you need to put more money into the system. That's the governor's call.
It does sound like you're saying that really these changes aren't as major as they're being made out to be, and really it's all about individual regulators and their judgment. Is that fair?
Well, you know, these are big changes, and, you know, in the execution of them there's inevitably a risk. My point is, though, that you have to recognise the key lessons to be learned are these, I think. Firstly, individual regulators have got to ask themselves not just about the health of individual institutions, but the connections with others. National regulators need to talk to each other. There needs to be more collaboration between regulators. And above all, if you come to the present day, what are the underlying problems we've still got to deal with? And that is, can every country, every regulator, hand on heart, say they have sorted out the problems of their individual banks? And are regulators in different countries aware of any residual problems or any problems still to be resolved? These are the issues. And there's no substitute for that, I'm afraid, of making sure that people get to the bottom of any problems, they share that information so there is as much openness as possible. That is the best way to get stability. The architecture follows from that.
Now, let's move on to the Office of Budget Responsibility. You denied that the growth forecast that you gave for 2011, which were quite out of line with the City forecasts and have been revised sharply down now, were massaged to meet political ends. What's your explanation, then, for why they were so out of line?
Well, look, if you take the growth figures for the current year, which I may say, when I announced them last year, were widely rubbished by commentators, but no one disputes them at all now. You know, the Office of Budget Responsibility hasn't changed its estimate there.
But it's the 2011 one.
They have changed that. When I published it, it was in line with, for example, the range published by the Bank of England. But as Sir Alan Budd, who chairs the new Office for Budget Responsibility, said, if you look at recent events, I'm not surprised he's being more cautious. Since the budget in March, I'm afraid things in Europe have deteriorated. You're seeing a lot of countries now retrenching, consolidating, and that will have an effect on the growth prospects of the United Kingdom, because Europe is our biggest trading partner. And I am worried that unless you, at the same time as cutting your deficits, which are absolutely essential, there's no dispute anywhere about that, unless you accompany that with measures to get growth, you run the risk of repeating the Japanese experience, where you choke off recovery, you bump along the bottom. Without growth, you will never get your deficit down, and you simply, as Japan has found, find that debt increases. I don't want to see that repeated in Europe, and I don't want to see it repeated in the United Kingdom.
Mr. Darling, just before you go, on the question of stress tests to banks, Spain is talking about them. Should the UK and the EU also go along that line?
Well, the Financial Services Authority we've just been discussing did conduct stress tests in relation to our banks. I think it is important that, and America, of course, did that last year as well.
Publishing them, isn't it? Making them more open.
I think in so many ways, the more openness there is, the more transparency there is, the better and more secure and the more confident people will be. The problem we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years is that things froze up when, frankly, institutions said, I don't believe what I'm being told. Now, the more open you can be, the more you can reassure, or if you've got problems, the more you can say you're fixing them by increasing capital, for example, then the better it will be. But I really do think that for any country that's in any doubt about it, these problems don't go away. It's rather like having a bad smell in the house. There's no point in ignoring it. You need to get the floorboards up. You need to fix the problems. You need to show that you're on top of things. And that is as essential now as that was 2 or 3 years ago. And I think that's the big issue that's actually facing us at the moment.
Alistair Darling, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.